These are three lies that, unfortunately, most retirees believe. I've been a financial advisor for over 20 years, and these three misconceptions, unfortunately, are literally stealing joy from retirees, and it's almost as if these lies are stealing money that you could be spending each year that you're not, and you're unnecessarily sacrificing. So let's jump in and talk about what these three lies are. And the first one is that you cannot spend more than 4%. There's a rule of thumb in the financial planning industry. It's called the 4% rule. Folks think, okay, I can spend 4% a year. I can increase that by inflation every year, and I'll be safe. It was developed by a gentleman by the name of Bill Bengen in the early to mid 1990s. And it's a decent rule of thumb, but we need to know what's involved with that, because if you're only spending 4% a year in your early retirement years, those are kind of your go-go years. So doing a cash flow analysis, understanding what you can spend, you can likely spend more than 4% in your early years, because most of us are going to decrease our spending after the first 5, 10, 12 years of retirement. We have our go-go years when we can go do things. Then we have the slow-go years after we've done the travel, we've done many of the adventures that we want to have. Spending tends to slow down a little bit. And then towards the end, unfortunately, our spending might increase. For many of us, it will increase because of healthcare costs. It's called the spending smile because it starts high, it goes down in the slow-go years, and then in the no-go years, it might go back up again. So just limiting yourself to 4% could be robbing you of adventures and trips and things that you want to do. Now, if the 4% rule doesn't work, then what does work? And none of what I'm sharing with you today is financial advice, but I do encourage you to visit with a fee-only financial advisor who can model this out. Let's say you're 4% a year, just to give me easy math. If you have $500,000, that's $20,000 that you can take out your first year in retirement, and then increase that by the rate of inflation every year. And the 4% rule would say you have a really, really high likelihood of never running out of money over a 30-year period, assuming that your money's invested certain ways. But to find out, instead of $20,000, could you spend 25% more? Could you spend $25,000? Could you spend $30,000 for your first couple years of retirement? To find that out, I encourage you to work with your financial advisor. Okay, the second rule also relates to the 4% rule, the second lie, I should say. And that is, if I spend more than 4%, I'm going to run out of money. So we need to understand that the 4% rule is based on what Bengen did is he used this statistical tool. This sounds boring, but stick with me because it's critically important. And looked and ran these different, it's called a Monte Carlo simulation, ran these different simulations using actual market returns, actual bond market returns. He assumed a 60-40 portfolio. He assumed 70% large cap U.S. stocks. He assumed 30 to 40% intermediate term U.S. treasuries. And then he looked at that. I mean, that's all details, but he looked at that. He ran these scenarios and said, okay, what's the least amount? What's the least amount? That's what I want you to think about. What's the least amount that somebody could spend and still run out of money? And that was 4%. Now, let's say Bengen ran 1,000 different scenarios, right? It's just a statistical model. He's using actual data, but using this simulation to kind of simulate 1,000 different lives, 1,000 different scenarios. And what he found was, in the worst case scenario, somebody ran out of money. It was somebody in the early 60s, if you happen to retire. It might have been 1966. That person ran out of money spending 4% a year. And so that's where that rule came from. But it's super important. I mean, imagine you run 1,000 different scenarios. And let me tell you, if you go back to 1870, and do 30-year look-back periods on that. Less than 10% of the time, so of those 1,000 scenarios that I mentioned, now this is actual real data, but of those cases, 30-year periods of time since 1870, less than 10% of the time, somebody finished spending 4% a year. Less than 10% of the time, somebody finished with less money than what they started with. So that's really shocking. And in fact, 2/3 of the time, people at the end of 30 years would have had more than double their money. And in fact, you're more likely to finish with 5 times your money than you are to finish with less than 1 times your money. So if you retire with $500,000, you're much more likely to finish with $2.5 million than you are to finish with less than $500,000. So that's really a shocking number. And so the 4% rule is based on worst case scenarios. Now, we need to use some tool, and the Monte Carlo tool is the best tool that financial advisors had. As I said earlier, I encourage you to work with your financial advisors so you can figure this out for yourself. But understanding how much you can spend in the first 5 years of retirement, when you have your full mental acuity, you're excited about retirement, you have your energy, you have your health, is super important. In fact, unfortunately, if you're 60 years old, or when you're 60 years old, most of us are going to have less than 1,000 weeks of healthy, active time remaining. And that's not a lot of time, and I want to see you take full advantage of that and get 110% out of what I call the youth of your senior years. Which brings me to my last point, which is, what is risk in retirement? Is risk in retirement the likelihood of running out of money, or is risk the likelihood of you never being able to enjoy the youth of your senior years? And that's what we have to be super careful with. As a financial advisor, I want my clients to have as high of a likelihood of never running out of money, of succeeding financially. And so for me, as a financial advisor, that means giving my clients a 95% likelihood of never running out of money, 97% likelihood. But we also have to balance this with what your goals are, right? To go from an 80% likelihood of never running out of money to 95, 97%, for most people is going to take 3 years of working and saving more, 3 years, maybe 5, maybe even 7 more years. So would you rather retire 5 or 7 years earlier and have an 80% likelihood of never running out of money? And what that means is in 80% of the cases, you're fine, right? In fact, in many of those cases, you're going to die with more money than what you started. Would you rather have an 80% likelihood and be able to retire 5, 6, 7 years earlier? Or would you rather have a 97% likelihood, but you're guaranteed of giving up those extra 5, 6, 7 years? For many of us, myself included, I'm okay with that 80% likelihood of success because I have 100% likelihood of gaining those extra 5 or 7 years in retirement, and only a 20% likelihood that maybe I have to cut back, maybe I have to modify things, right? We don't fly the plane into the ground, right, as we're coming in for approach. As we live life, we see what's happening and we make slight modifications along the way. And that's why working with a financial advisor, not just one time, but over a period of time, can be helpful, particularly if you retired a little bit early and you're not at that 97% likelihood, just to see where am I at and am I okay? And that's kind of why I made this other video, which is about getting full advantage of the youth of your senior years, 5 reasons to retire as soon as you can. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in that one. Bye-bye.